Tony's big idea was separate show. We're going to separate everybody. And I said, that'll never work. Just let me go. These guys don't want me here. This isn't a real business. This isn't a business predicated on making money, drawing money, selling tickets, doing business. It's not what it was sold to me as. So let me go.
For those of you who might not be familiar with that guy, that's CM Punk. He is a controversial figure in the wrestling industry, to say the least, known for telling some tall tales. Since he was fired from AEW, he had an axe to grind about the company, obviously, but I somehow couldn't dismiss these comments out of hand because I felt those same feelings 2 years ago. Welcome back to the channel, guys. And today we're going to be going over the rise and sad decline of All Elite Wrestling. You might not be a wrestling fan, but you need to hear this story. And you need to hear it because of how sad it is and because of how easily this can happen to you. It's a story of how carelessness, bad storytelling, ego, and bad leadership can ruin a product that had a very rare gift. All the goodwill in the world when it started. You obviously don't want that to happen to you, and I don't want it to happen to you either, so let's begin. Here is a case in point about my feelings from 2 years ago. This is Wardlow. In the spring of 2022, this guy was on fire. He was popular with men, for obvious reasons. He even increased ratings with women for reasons that are probably obvious too. He was a homegrown star. He didn't see a second of airtime on WWE programming. Wardlow declared that he wanted to be the reason why AEW increased its viewership with women and in the all-important 18 to 49 demo. And there was nothing that should have stopped him from doing that. All AEW needed to do was what it had been doing. Let him kick ass on a weekly basis and give him good villains to work with for bigger story arcs. But AEW couldn't do this. Instead, at the height of his popularity after beating the crap out of MJF, who was AEW's biggest villain, it had Wardlow ignore the company's top title. He did win the company's secondary title, and then he got into 20-minute struggles with low-tier wrestlers, disappeared for a few weeks at a time, and did pretty much the same thing when he came back. Unsurprisingly, Wardlow faded, and AEW lost a chance for a breakout star. And that's a good microcosm of this company as a whole. AEW was once the hottest act in town. It brought CM Punk back from a 7-year hiatus, and it wasn't done there. In months, it lured Daniel Bryan and Adam Cole away from WWE, and AEW was often getting over 1 million viewers a week on its weekly show Dynamite. Its audience skewed younger than WWE's as well, and it was selling out Arthur Ashe Stadium in New York City, which was a clear signal of its power because New York City is WWE's traditional home base. Less than 3 years later, though, the audience has been cut in half, and attendance is crashing. On June 19th, 2024, it had a record low rating of 502,000 viewers, and as of June 14th, attendance for a July 3rd event in Chicago, which is AEW's home base, was on track to be about 2,800. I wrote the script before that event, so I'm not sure what the number was, but you can clearly see the downward trend, because in November of last year, attendance in that same venue was over 5,000. And so, yeah, you can argue that it would be lower due to the July 4th holiday, but this has been a trend in AEW for a while now, and holidays and other things like that don't explain drops that big. So, what happened? How did AEW go from making all these waves to being a laughingstock that people are abandoning in droves? To appreciate just how steep AEW's fall has been, we need to look at the landscape in its industry just before its rise. Ever since Vince McMahon bought WCW in March 2001, WWE had been a monopoly in the wrestling business. Yes, there were minor promotions and TNA started to gain some ground in the mid to late 2000s, but it was nothing that could ever threaten or challenge WWE, and Vince knew it. When you have a monopoly, you tend to get higher prices, a lower quality product, and less innovation. And that is exactly what happened with WWE between 2001 and 2019. As it strengthened its monopoly and Vince got older, it became more and more routine and stubbornly set in its ways. I took multiple years-long hiatuses from watching any wrestling at all at this time, and I was far from alone. The late 2010s in particular were a horrible time in WWE. It was the era of the part-timer where WWE was reliant on the 40 and 50-year-old stars of yesteryear to show up once in a blue moon and draw interest because it couldn't create any new stars on its weekly programming. Some things were improving, most notably women's wrestling, but this was far from sufficient to save it. Because WWE was so awful at this time, there was a boom in independent wrestling. New Japan was hot, Ring of Honor and other small leagues were getting attention. I saw more random people wearing Bullet Club shirts on the streets of New York City than WWE shirts at this time. And the ultimate proof came on September 1st, 2018, when Cody Rhodes and the Young Bucks organized the All In event in Chicago. It had attendance of over 11,200 people, over 50,000 people bought the pay-per-view, so no non-WWE wrestling event had done that in the United States since WCW, and so this proved the concept that there was a pent-up demand. 4 months later, All Elite Wrestling was created with the backing of the billionaire Khan family. In the spring of 2019, AEW reached a national broadcasting deal with TNT, the same network that used to run WCW. This was all huge news, and it came so suddenly. For the first time in 2 decades, WWE had something that looked like it could be a viable competitor, and the wrestling fans who had long suffered under Vince McMahon's monopoly were understandably excited. AEW didn't disappoint with its first event, Double or Nothing, on May 25, 2019, and it continued that momentum when it premiered on TV and long after that. WWE tried to stop AEW's growth by putting the NXT brand on the USA Network against it on Wednesday nights, but AEW almost always won these ratings wars, particularly in the critical 18 to 49 demo. WWE ultimately had no choice but to wave the white flag and move NXT to Tuesdays. And COVID could have been a disaster for AEW, but it somehow survived and thrived during that storm too. That's how big the pent-up demand for non-WWE wrestling was. So yeah, people were sick of Vince McMahon's monopoly, but why else was AEW so strong? Was it only because WWE was in the shitter at this time? The answer is no, it wasn't. It had its own strengths too. Because at a time when AEW was overproducing and scripting everything to death, AEW felt like wrestling when it was at its best. So you had to ask yourself, why spend your time watching the sanitized corporate machine when anything could happen in AEW? It was violent, it was gritty, the wrestlers and announcers talked like real people instead of badly programmed robots. Vince McMahon's 6-year-old toilet humor was completely absent. It felt like what a wrestling show should feel like. I remember after watching that first episode of Dynamite in September 2019 that I couldn't wait to see what happened next. I hadn't felt that way about a WWE program since 2001. But even during these early days, though, you could see that there were signs of trouble. things that had no business being on TV, like the Dark Order faction that was supposed to be a cult but was really just cringeworthy, occurred regularly. The Dark Order may have had slick production packages, but they weren't enough to make you suspend your disbelief and accept this faction and take it seriously. You just couldn't. Brody Lee jumped ship from WWE in 2020, and he almost saved the Dark Order, but he tragically died from a rare illness at the end of that year. However, the Dark Order lingered on as a tribute group, which was nice, but it felt meaningless. And to make matters worse, the faction got involved in the main AEW story at this time, which was about the rise of Hangman Adam Page to the company's world title. The group was supposed to act as the badly needed friends for Page, but it was so dorky that it made him look bad, and you wound up taking him less seriously as the main character in the story, so it backfired pretty badly. In general, there was just a lot of weird stuff that felt like an inside joke meant for the independent wrestling scene, and maybe it was appropriate for that context, but it wasn't appropriate for a company with a live weekly TV show broadcast to a national audience on a mainstream channel. And I'll get into the worst example of that later because he deserves a section all on his own. Other things were even more random. The company signed a lot of wrestlers, which was natural since it was expanding, but it didn't have a plan for most of them, so it created a bunch of slapdash factions that were even more meaningless than the Dark Order and led to a lot of hours of filler TV time. There were also a lot of errors in audio-visual and other such things, which proved the company was still an amateur when it came to national broadcasts. And while this was tolerable if you were in AEW's target audience, which was a lapsed or disillusioned wrestling fan looking for an alternative to WWE, on the other hand, if you were outside of it, you wouldn't have been impressed. It wasn't a good image, and it suggested that the company was not as professionally run as it should be. Not a good thing if AEW was trying to expand beyond its initial target audience. But for the moment, AEW was new enough, WWE was bad enough, and goodwill was high enough that these things could be overlooked. Still, they were always there and came to a head in 2022. 2022 should have been a year of incredible growth for the company. It signed a lot of big names as WWE went through a period of pandemic-era layoffs. Other names didn't want to re-sign with WWE, and still others came just because they wanted to come. Christian Cage, Andrade, Malachi Black, Adam Cole, Bryan Danielson, CM Punk, the list goes on. With these names, WWE's crappy quality, and the world returning to normal as the pandemic ended, there was no reason why AEW shouldn't have blossomed into a true, legitimate, mainstream competitor to WWE that year. But it didn't. Just the opposite. 2022 was instead AEW's disaster year. It went from a burgeoning competitor to a niche product, basically a super indie league that happens to have its own TV show. Why? Well, first of all, Cody Rhodes, who was maybe the most important architect behind the company, left. He was the first big name to jump ship the other way, returning to WWE, and we all know how that eventually turned out. It was the first in a series of blows that would send the company to the canvas. Remember when I said that there was a lot of weird stuff in AEW that was appropriate for an indie promotion but not a mainstream TV show? Orange Cassidy is the epitome of this. This is a guy whose character is basically the lovable, lazy guy. One of his nicknames is the King of Sloth style. He gets into the ring lazily, he does lazy kicks, he rarely speaks, but when he does, he often talks nonsense. According to James Sipperly, I'm not sure if that's the pronunciation, the man behind the character, its motivations are, quote, "If I have to wrestle, I'll wrestle. It's not my fault that I'm good at wrestling. It's like one of those things. You have a job, you're good at it, but do you really want to?" Now, this guy was originally brought in as a comedy character, and his persona is fine for that, but there were two problems. One, the joke stayed the same for years, and two, slowly but surely, Orange Cassidy started becoming a major player in serious stories. So do you remember Wardlow? Shortly after he won the company's secondary title, he had a 20 or so minute match with Orange Cassidy. Now, look at these two guys and tell me something. Does Wardlow look and feel like somebody who should be struggling with Orange Cassidy? You know the answer, but struggle he did. This was the time when Wardlow was at the peak of his popularity, but the company decided that this match was a good idea. So here we had a character that felt one note, the joke had worn off even by then, but he's winning titles and being presented as one of AEW's most important characters. Getting more TV time than much more interesting people. In some ways it made sense because he sold a lot of merchandise, but this character, Orange Cassidy, was clearly detrimental to the presentation of other characters. Pushing these niche characters at the expense of stars that could have a more mainstream appeal accelerated in 2022, and it was one of the things that began turning me off to AEW. But obviously, there was a lot more. If you read a book called Wired for Story by Lisa Cron, one of the most important concepts you'll come across is that of a story versus things that happen. Quote, "A story is designed from beginning to end to answer a single overarching question. Thus, it would seem that when you're writing a story, defining what it's about should be simple, yet it often proves to be maddeningly elusive. Despite our best intention, the narrative meanders, spending way too much time wandering aimlessly down back roads. So in the end, although a lot of interesting events take place, they don't add up to anything. No question is asked, let alone answered. The story is so full of things the reader doesn't need to know that it has no focus, so it isn't really a story, it's just a collection of things that happen." And Matt Hardy, who worked for the company for a number of years, said this in a recent interview about his time in AEW. Quote, "I feel like AEW is more focused on having a 5-star match as opposed to having a segment that is hugely impactful and makes a moment." And you would see this even during AEW's glory days. You'd see matches on TV that didn't really have a reason for happening. They were just there. It wasn't that the wrestlers weren't good or you didn't think they'd have a good match, but these good matches were the problem here. Professional wrestling isn't boxing or MMA. You don't watch it for the competition. You watch it for the same reason you watch an action movie, to get a story out of it. Tony Khan, the company's president, could build some good stories on the way to a pay-per-view, but the weekly programming in AEW was lacking, especially as the company's novelty wore off. A lot of what we saw on Dynamite every week was just random thrown together matches. The whole business with Orange Cassidy that damaged Wardlow's star power was one such match. Now, you might recall that I mentioned this concept about a story versus things that happen in my video about the Silmarillion, which you can watch after this one. The same thing that plagued Tolkien plagued AEW from the beginning. But unlike Tolkien, Tony Khan isn't exactly a creative genius, so his content's problems are much more glaring, and that's not even his worst issue. To go over AEW's problems in depth, we should also revisit concepts from my Ocarina of Time and Odd Girl Out videos. Do you remember what I said about multitasking and the paradox of choice in those videos? If you don't, you should watch them. But here's a reminder. According to the social psychologist Robert Cialdini, multitasking doesn't really exist. We can't pay attention to more than one thing at a time. What we instead do is shift our focus between tasks, but the price of doing this is what he calls an attentional blink. For a time, our focus is reduced and we wind up doing everything worse. In Barry Schwartz's The Paradox of Choice, we find that when we're presented with too many options, our decision-making process is harmed. Too many choices can lead to decreases in satisfaction, something which I experienced when I was in the process of buying this new laptop that I'm shooting this video on. AEW was skirting the line with both of these things by signing so many wrestlers at once, but in March 2022, it made both of these problems much worse. Tony Khan triumphantly took to the stage, to the ring, and announced that he bought the Ring of Honor promotion, but instead of just using the tape library or setting Ring of Honor up as a developmental brand, he decided to feature it often on AEW's weekly programming. Ring of Honor titles and Ring of Honor branded matches were always on Dynamite at that time, and it added to the story versus things that happen problem because you never understood the reason for any of it. It was just there, blurring AEW's identity. There were so many titles on the show that it felt like everyone had a championship belt. I'm sure you can tell, even without having seen anything, that this was a huge problem. AEW's programming became a gigantic, random mess. Was I watching AEW or was I watching some random league that I never had watched before? All I knew at that time was that I kept getting confused and distracted from what I thought I should be watching. Now, at the same time as AEW was botching its good things and making a mess of its programming, there was another problem. And we can't leave this subject without discussing how badly CM Punk was handled. One of the troubling signs for AEW in early 2022 was that it felt like the company wasn't doing much with Hangman Adam Page. This was the man it spent the first 2.5 years of its existence pushing toward the top title. Since Double or Nothing 2019, the audience was being conditioned to think of Page as the homegrown top guy. Even when CM Punk and Daniel Bryan Danielson came, AEW decided to continue to tell the story it had been telling since its inception and have Page complete his journey to the world title. There were a lot of people at the time saying that this was a mistake because Punk and Danielson were obviously much bigger names, and case in point, Danielson main evented WrestleMania against Roman Reigns just months before he came. Punk or Danielson versus Kenny Omega, who was the champion at the time and who was the poster boy for the boom in independent wrestling in the late 2010s, would have obviously drawn a lot of interest. But Tony Khan decided to stick to his guns and continue telling the story he had been telling for 2 years, and this was a move that I applauded at the time. But then Page won the title and basically did nothing with it. He had a story with Adam Cole, but there was no chemistry to it. It was basically referencing their history on the independent scene that most mainstream viewers, myself included, had no awareness of. AEW didn't try to broaden the appeal of their program. Again, it was a good illumination of the company as a whole, unfortunately. Instead, CM Punk and MJF were the ones stealing the show every week at that time. This was a rivalry a lot of fans had been dreaming about for years, and to their credit and to the company's credit, they delivered. Good for them, bad for Page. CM Punk then beat MJF and went for Page's title. He won, and Page dropping the belt felt like it wasn't a big deal at all. Again, this was the guy, remember, that AEW had spent over 2 years building at the opportunity cost of having some of the biggest stories and matches that they could have asked for, and his losing the title yet felt like an afterthought. But there was an incident along the way that hinted of even bigger problems, backstage problems. It's a long and twisted saga that I don't want to go into detail about here, but during Punk and Page's rivalry, real life animosity came out on screen, and these seeds would grow into something very embarrassing. Then, after he won the title, CM Punk jumped into the crowd on the next episode of Dynamite and broke his foot, an injury which required surgery. AEW stalwart Jon Moxley, who was one of the key big players in making the company viable at the beginning, stepped in as the interim champion, so these two were on a collision course. CM Punk returned earlier than expected, and on the August 24th, 2022 episode of Dynamite, Moxley crushed him. It was a shocking match, a shocking result. The company played up how CM Punk wasn't quite ready after his injury, but then AEW made the worst of this story. Jon Moxley conveniently issued an open challenge for the title at the next pay-per-view, All Out in Chicago, and conveniently CM Punk's coach, Ace Steel, who most people, myself included, had probably never seen or heard of before, but who the company thought was a big deal with no introduction, gave CM Punk a pep talk. Then suddenly CM Punk signed the contract and we all knew what was coming next. Do you remember in my Ocarina of Time video when I said that the best stories never remind you that what you're seeing isn't real? Well, this one did. It was obvious that the only reason for any of this was to give CM Punk a win in his hometown of Chicago, which is exactly what happened. AEW could have had the basis of a good story if it played up the injury angle leading into All Out instead of bringing CM Punk back early, or if it used that angle as the basis of a long quest after All Out when Moxley beat him. But it chose the most convenient, illusion-shattering option that it could. I remember watching at the time and going, yeah, this sucks, I have no interest in watching All Out, and I didn't. But that's not even the worst of this story, because that's not what this event is remembered for. The aftermath was even worse than the build-up. The reality got much more talk than the fiction. During the post-event press conference, CM Punk went on a wild rant. He sounded off on his legal saga with Colt Cabana, who was another wrestler with the company. He talked about how he shares a bank account with his mom, Colt Cabana does. He cursed out the company's executive vice presidents, Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks, saying they couldn't manage an effing target. He ranted about Adam Page, calling him an empty-headed effing dumb F, and said, quote, "When somebody who has never done a damn thing in this business jeopardizes the first $1 million house that this company has ever drawn off of my back and goes on national television and does that, it's a disgrace to this industry, it's a disgrace to this company." Remember, Hangman Adam Page was the major project for AEW's first 2.5 years as a company. And here's CM Punk saying that he never did a damn thing in the business. CM Punk then said that he worked with effing children. And as CM Punk was saying all of this, he had the championship belt on one side of him and Tony Khan on the other. And Tony was sitting there looking impotent. And I think that was the thing that did more damage to AEW than anything else that I've mentioned in this video up to now, because it made you wonder who was really in charge of this company. For all of his flaws, and there are countless of them, Vince McMahon would have never allowed this in a billion years. nor would Triple H. But the worst was unfortunately still to come because a fight broke out after this press conference. The result was that CM Punk was stripped of the title that AEW had just used such a horrible story to give to him, and he, the company's own executive vice presidents, Ace Steel, and others were all suspended, but it was unfortunately far too late for Tony Khan to save his image. Which brings us to our final section, because to truly understand why AEW is failing, as always, you need to go to the top. The tone of an organization always comes from the top, and that episode at All Out was symbolic in more ways than one, because it showed just how out of depth Tony Khan always was in his role as the president of a wrestling company. There were early signs that things were going to come to this. Tony Khan felt more like a fan than a boss. He publicly hugged a lot of the wrestlers he signed or worked with in ways that can only be described as awkward. And this is partly what led to the Brawl Out disaster, because everybody knew that Tony Khan was a huge CM Punk fan, including CM Punk. I think you can see the problem here. Something subtly changed from the company's early days. Even before its horrible year, that explosive energy you felt in the 2019 episodes of Dynamite gradually felt like it got lost. Part of that was, as I said, because the novelty was wearing off, but there was more to it. In 2021, reports came out that gradually the EVPs, whose passion and creative vision were responsible for the creation of AEW, lost power as Tony Khan assumed more creative control. And Tony confirmed this when he said, quote, "The structure changed for me at the end of 2019, and it was because of me. I felt like I needed to take over and be more accountable as the CEO and as the booker. I was the final say, but there were probably too many different people with input on segments, and this show wasn't as organized at the end of 2019 as I thought it could be. So for the past 2 years, we've been a lot more organized, and I've written every show by hand, which allows me to know which segments are where, and I think the shows have gotten significantly better. The fans have enjoyed them more. They've performed better in terms of the ratings, and it's been a good change for us." And to an extent, this was true. Things were more chaotic in those early days. But are the fans really enjoying the shows more? That's debatable, because Tony Khan's tastes aren't exactly conducive to mainstream success. In everything from the weekly programming to the squandered opportunities to the excessive fraternizing with the wrestlers to Brawl Out, you just can't escape the impression that Tony Khan is not an organized person, which is fine because a lot of people aren't. I'm not exactly the most organized guy in the world either, but I recognize this in myself as a weakness and have tried various ways to mitigate that weakness. Cody's departure made things worse because of all the founders. He was clearly the one that had the most sense for storytelling and for business. It's hard to see the noticeable decline in AEW programming shortly after his departure and not come to that conclusion. Tony Khan might have taken more control, supposedly in a bid for better organization, but he seemed to have no idea about his many limitations, which is something very much like Vince McMahon, by the way. But for all his many professional and personal flaws, Vince understood at his core what would appeal to a mass audience. It became clear to me in 2022 that Tony doesn't. His tastes line up with this sort of niche independent wrestling product, which isn't the best approach to national TV. But now, with Cody gone, for example, he has no one to tell him otherwise. Now, to add some injury to insult, CM Punk also suffered a triceps tear at All Out, which put him out of action until June 2023. A few months later, he was involved in yet another backstage fight and was fired from AEW. In April 2024, in response to the comments CM Punk made that I showed you at the start of this video, Tony released the footage of what happened, and it largely confirmed CM Punk's version of events, which wound up making Tony Khan look like a jealous ex trying to embarrass the girl that dumped him. You could see the embarrassment on the faces of actual professionals who worked for the company, like Tony Schiavone and Renee Paquette. They wanted nothing to do with this. This had no business being put on national TV, but I fortunately didn't watch it. I heard about it secondhand. Why? Because at some point around Brawl Out, I stopped watching AEW because I stopped caring, and I haven't watched since. It didn't help that as AEW was going through this disaster year, Vince McMahon's history as a sexual predator finally caught up with him and forced him out of power. Triple H took over as the WWE showrunner, and within weeks it suddenly got fun again. Much more fun than what Tony Khan was putting out. But that isn't the reason why I stopped watching AEW. It wasn't because WWE got better. I stopped watching AEW because it just wasn't fun anymore. And that's what's sad about all of this. I want AEW to succeed. Competition is good for everybody. The last thing anyone wants or needs is another WWE monopoly. I want two hot companies going at each other. That's what gave us the glory days between 1995 and 2001 in the Monday Night Wars. I miss those days. I miss having to wonder what was going to be the better show of the week between Raw and Nitro. But that's not going to happen with AEW's current leadership. And that's really sad because there's otherwise no reason why it shouldn't. The talent is there, the production values are now there, the national TV broadcast is there. But as I mentioned in the Rings of Power vs. Shogun video, if the writing isn't there, nothing else is going to work, and that's exactly what we're seeing with AEW right now. WWE is now Shogun, and AEW is Rings of Power. And until Tony Khan hires a real showrunner who's actually a boss rather than a fan, that's not going to change. The biggest lesson here with this whole AEW debacle is that you have to know your weaknesses. You have to put your ego aside, acknowledge your limitations, and take measures to mitigate them. Tony Khan doesn't do that. Like Vince, he does the opposite. He also has an echo chamber of groupies, especially the Young Bucks who only amplify his worst instincts. The second lesson that we should take away from AEW's decline is that if you want your content to succeed, you better give your audience a reason to care about it. You better be telling a story and not just throwing out a bunch of things that happen. Once novelty wears off, your audience isn't going to pay attention anymore. The third thing that you should learn from all of this is that you need to strike when the iron is hot. If you have something that's working, push it as far as it will go. Don't dilute it with other things just because you might like those other things more. I've been disappointed by the performance of my Ocarina of Time video because that game and story meant so much to me. But my audience is responding to my webtoon videos, so I'm going to keep doing more of that and not try to dilute those videos with other subjects I might like more just to get some more views for them. The fourth thing that you should remember from all of this is that people can only pay attention to one thing at a time, and too much choice can lead to weaker preferences. Having Wardlow be competitive with Orange Cassidy didn't help both of them as Tony Khan probably intended. It just made Wardlow look worse at the time he most needed to look good. Tony might have wanted to give the audience the choice of Orange Cassidy because he's a huge fan of Orange Cassidy, but that didn't pay off too well in the long run, did it? So that's all for this week. I want to take this time to thank my Patreon supporters, and here you all are. If you want to join this glorious muster roll and get get your name featured in these videos, plus a bunch of other goodies besides. The link is in the description. Or if you want to buy this script or send me a small love letter, you can go to my Ko-fi page, which is also linked in the description. Thank you all for watching to the end, because that helps a lot too. And if you want to help this channel grow in the smallest way, please hit that like button and leave a comment. Do you agree with me on the reasons for the decline of AEW? Let me know. Each like and comment helps me in my fight against the real heel in this business, which is the YouTube algorithm. Next time, we're going to be doing another webtoon video, which is going to be about my 10 favorite webtoon characters right now, and why I think they're so well written. Until then, keep writing and keep fighting.